when they talk about fighting right-wing ideologies, what they mean is me and you.
Prevent has been astoundingly useless at preventing terror. Well, let me qualify that.
Why do they feel more or want to claim that external homeland rather than where they were born and their parents were born? That's the question that governments are too scared to ask and answer.
But obviously we have a Labour government, they are multicultural fanatics, so naturally it's in their interest to want to silence people that oppose the consequences of their ideology of mass immigration.
Hello and welcome to The Protagonists here on The Pulse with me, Nick Buckley. Have we got a fantastic show lined up for you today? The title of the show today, and we'll be discussing this topic, is UK's Prevent programme and targeting of right-wing ideologies. Will it silence critics of mass immigration? Will it? Or is the cat out the bag now? Everybody I speak to is sick of mass immigration. But before we get to that, let me introduce the three wonderful guests we have today. Our first guest is Alec Cave, founding member of the Homeland Party. Shane Healy, youth justice expert, intelligence operator and a private military contractor. And Harry Miller, a former police officer and co-founder of Fair Cop, a campaigning group hoping to remove politics from the police. Let's jump into this. Alec, when they talk about fighting right-wing ideologies, what they mean is me and you. That's what they mean. They're coming after me and you because both of us want to see mass deportations from the UK. Alec?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels as time goes by, with every year that goes by, what is considered normal or used to be is now considered extreme. And eventually everybody is going to be caught by this categorization of right-wing or extreme right-wing. That's the adjective they like to put at the beginning. But yeah, and as you said about mass deportations, that's a completely normal response to mass immigration. If you've imported millions and millions of people within such a short span of time, and of course that's incredibly damaging, then a mistake has been made and mistakes have to be corrected. And so, but obviously we have a Labour government. They are multicultural fanatics. So naturally it's in their interest to want to silence people that oppose the consequences of their ideology of mass immigration.
Just a point there, even though everything he said there is correct, the Tories were just as bad. Everything that's going wrong in our country now was allowed to go wrong under 14 years of Tory rule. They're the ones who ramped up mass immigration. They're the ones who set up the Prevent programme. They're the ones who created DEI, non-crime hate incidents. The Tories just had better PR than Labour. Labour inherited the country at the worst possible time again, and they're terrible as well. I'm not sticking up for Labour. They're terrible. But we need to remind ourselves the Tories did so much damage. Shane, I'm an expert in preventing young people getting involved in crime. Been doing it for 20 years, won awards. Prevention is really, really important, but it's so hard to be able to quantify that the work you did actually stopped people becoming criminals in the first place. So if we look at prevent, obviously what Prevent's about is in its title, is trying to prevent people getting involved in extremism and terrorism. How they prove that's very difficult. What's your take on UK Prevent programme?
So I had a little bit to do with the implementation or the draft of it, and because of the programs I was working on in Australia, we're the only program that has 100% success rate from both intervention and rehabilitation of convicted juvenile violent extremists / terrorists. It all starts in the schools with information, education and knowledge. You've got to really educate those frontline people, teachers, social workers, to start looking at signs of shifting along the spectrum from inquisitiveness to radicalization into extremism and then into violent extremism, which is the agreeable to use violence to get your ideology across. It's not an overnight thing. It happens progressively. And if you can educate those like we did in Australia, I went out and presented presentations to over 3,000 youth justice workers, police, government officials, NGOs that work with youth in the streets, to actually explain some signs of where someone is starting to get along that spectrum of radicalization into extremism. The way I explain it is like a bus. You know, it depends on what bus stop you get on, who's on the bus when you're on there, how that happens, and then where you get off and who you get off with.
So it's obvious that the Prevent program was started with the best intentions. You know, it came to be in about 2006 after the London bombings, where 52 people were killed. And it makes sense to prevent people becoming terrorists rather than having to deal with the terrorists once they've committed horrendous atrocities. Harry, like many things in the UK, and you talk about this all the time, like many things in the UK, Prevent has become politicized. Prevent has become part of the controlling system to ensure we only talk about certain things, we only can think in one direction. Is that an exaggeration? What's your take on Prevent?
It's not an exaggeration at all, Nick. I always think of the words of the great economist Milton Friedman, who said that a policy must not be judged by its intention, but by its practice. And so it's utterly irrelevant to me whether the intention of Prevent was good, bad, or indifferent. I'm quite happy to accept that it was great intention. It's the same with non-crime hate incidents. The intention there was to nip hate crime in the bud before it happened. But you cannot judge a policy by its intention, only by its practice. And in practice, Prevent has been astoundingly useless at preventing terror. Well, let me qualify that. Of course, it may have been successful about preventing terrorism because we're trying to judge on counterfactuals. There may have been a whole bunch of terrorist activities that did not happen as a result of preventing them. So we have to acknowledge that. But what I will say is this: that Prevent, certainly over the last few years, have been heavily engaged in what you would rightly call political thought crime policing. I'll give you just two examples. In last year, Prevent attended the home of a 12-year-old autistic boy because he'd done a little TikTok video where he'd said that he was gay, not queer. So this was the dangerous ideology that Prevent said that he was flirting with. And then they went on and said that a TikTok video of himself firing a toy wooden crossbow in his own back garden that shoots foam arrows, and which is readily available on the English Heritage website, was a case of this young boy having engaged with dangerous ideology, was now taking an unhealthy interest in weaponry. Now, that is complete and utter bollocks, Nick. You cannot possibly equate that with terrorism. If Prevent are busy doing that, they have lost the plot entirely. There's another instance. Following the riots last summer, a lovely 19-year-old charity worker was visited in her own home in Merseyside by Prevent. They asked her, not was she engaged in terrorism, but why she had religious iconography on the wall. She's a Catholic. She asked whether she had any strong opinions about the Conservative Party, about immigration, and whether she had any sympathies at all with any of the causes that may be associated with the riots. They then questioned her about the presence in the family home of what they described as an Anglo-Saxon helmet. It wasn't an Anglo-Saxon helmet. It was a replica Roman helmet owned by her father, and it was in a display case. What they decided with this was indicative of her terrorist state of mind. Now, when Prevent are doing that kind of thing, they have lost the plot. So, irrespective of intention, they need a good hard looking at, and in my opinion, they need at worst disbanding, or at best pointing in the correct direction.
Isn't the problem here that Prevent are trying to come across as anti-racist? The politicians and Prevent look at their book of all their referrals, everyone they're working with, and go, oh, it's 90% brown Muslims. That cannot be right. We need to increase our referrals of white people, of Chinese people, of girls, because we need equity across the board in our referrals. Otherwise, it looks like we are racist and a racist organisation. Hence why Reform came out last year and want referrals now for misogyny. If you're a lad now being sexist in school, you can get referred into Prevent for being a misogynist. It's, for me, I've worked in government for 10 years. I know how these things work. This is all about how it looks to politicians. Alec, you've seen this happen. I'm not sure if any of your members have been referred into Prevent for wanting deportation. I'll be surprised if I've not been referred at some point into Prevent. Alec, do you think Prevent has, but obviously you think Prevent's lost its way. Why do you think it's lost its way? Because it was set up to deal with Islamic terrorism after London bombing. 30 years ago, it should have been dealing with IRA, Irish bombings. But at this moment in time, the threat comes from Islamic bombings. Alec?
Yes. Well, obviously, our civil service is occupied by progressive ideologues. And these people always expand the remit of their department. So, as you pointed out, it was supposed to deal with genuine threats of terrorism. Of course, a couple of decades ago, we started to see the increase of Islamic terrorism. So it's only natural that the government would respond by creating a department to try and tackle that. But as I say, progressive ideologues are in these departments. And so they naturally want to use their power and authority to also achieve their ideological aims, which is, of course, to silence people that do not share their worldview, which is, of course, is the majority of ordinary folk. The majority of ordinary folk don't want multiculturalism. And that's why you've now seen just recently, it was said that Prevent now even consider cultural nationalism for more than just ethnic nationalism, just cultural nationalism is now considered a pipeline towards terrorism, which is absolutely insane because this happened only a week or so after Keir Starmer gave a speech saying immigration is turning our country into an island of strangers. I mean, that could be considered cultural nationalism, could it not? Because he's basically saying that mass immigration is changing our culture and is thus undermining social cohesion. So the problem is the bureaucracy. We have to root out these progressive ideologues who are using their department beyond what it was set up to do.
Shane, you might not know this because obviously you're in Australia, but some of the stuff coming out Prevent about how they red flag right-wing terrorist threats or people who may be going down that path. I'll read some of them out. What we got here? So we're looking at there's a book list that might be a red flag if you own books on this book list. It's not Mein Kampf. It's not other books you might think of. It's not the terrorist handbook to build bombs. It's books by Douglas Murray. It's Lord of the Rings. And then they've also named comedy shows, British comedy shows such as Yes Minister, which is a satirical take on the civil service in the UK from the 80s and 90s. These are mainstream. But if you own or see these things, watch these things now, it's a red flag. We had police officers going to a former police officer's house a couple of months ago, and he was being arrested. And on their camcorders, they were recorded looking at his bookcase going, we don't like it. His books are a bit Brexity, meaning it looks like he supports Brexit, leaving the European Union. How you can come out with that comment, I have no idea. But this is the level of infiltration of this new ideology that there's only one way of thinking and only one true way of this country being run. Shane?
So my first question would be, and like I said, I saw the original draft, is what professional judgment tool is the government using? Are they using the Vera 2R? Are they using the Trap 18 to use as a guide to see where on the violent extremism radicalisation spectrum an individual is? Our AFP's arrested a 14-year-old autistic boy for a similar issue and actually charged him with terrorism because he was looking up certain terrorist groups, and they've continued on looking at that. So we use the Vera 2R under our law, and so the first thing that I do is go through that professional judgment tool and look at the complete spectrum of an individual's journey into, or potential, or accused journey into radicalisation. So to go in and just look at a bookshelf should be one piece of a massive puzzle that you put together, not just a definite, that guy's got a Douglas Murray book. So my first question would be, what professional judgment tool is the government using to determine an individual is on the pathway or has become radicalised to a adversarial ideology? Because there is no event. You just don't become radicalised overnight. It's a journey. And so my question would be to the British authorities is, what is your process now under Prevent? What tools are you using to determine someone's ideology and if they are radicalised, if they are an extremist, or if they have the potential to become a violent extremist? That's the key question. And in Australia, in court, both sides have to get experts to prepare Vera 2Rs, which you can look at online. It's out of the Netherlands. It's an excellent tool to use to go through someone's entire range of indicators. It's just not one, he read a book or she said this or he's doing that. It's a range of categories, and you go from low to moderate, low, moderate to high, extremely high. So that would be my first question to those running Prevent now. What professional judgment tool are you using to determine someone's ideology?
Just off the top of your head, Shane, can you think of any reason why Lord of the Rings and Shakespeare should be a red flag?
No. But having been in domestic intelligence agencies, sometimes they're false flags because they have other information. And I'm not justifying anything, because I think the whole autistic thing is, and if you're ridiculous, and I'm fighting on his behalf in Australia, to say anyone with autism at a juvenile level, if you understand anything about autism, they're inquisitive, they're going to go down rabbit holes. So, but sometimes agencies don't have all the information, but they will be tasked with taking, and I do it myself. First thing I'll do is I'll look at someone's bookcase to see and their online presence to see what they're being influenced by. But if you look at my books, I'd be locked straight up. So because I read everything. So, but it should just be an indicator. It shouldn't be a factual 1 point bit of data that determines an ideology.
Yeah, if you looked at my bookcase now, I've got Mein Kampf on my bookcase, as well as the Quran. No, exactly.
And the Bible.
Yep. Gents, stay with us. We need to go for a break now. And when we get back, we will continue this conversation here at The Pulse. Welcome back to The Protagonist here at The Pulse with me, Nick Buckley. We're discussing the UK's Prevent programme, which seems to be veering off in a direction that no one predicted and no one thought needed to be looked at in the first place, because Prevent was created after the London bombings where 52 people were killed by 4 suicide bombers. Harry, why do you think we've got mission creep? Prevent may or may not be working. It may be doing some good work behind the scenes, because we'll never know. Preventing stuff, as you said, we'll never know if it did. But why do you think it's crept into right-wing ideology, so-called far right. I'm sure there is far right people in the country. I'm sure there is far right terrorists who are sat in a bedroom somewhere hoping to plant a bomb or hurt people. I'm sure they exist, but surely they're a tiny number of people. Why is Prevent creeping into this field?
Well, because Prevent, along with all of the police and forces in the United Kingdom, have become increasingly political. They've adopted a state orthodoxy that has very little to do with democracy, and they've become the armed wing of that of a political state. That's the simple reason, and the reason that they are less likely to go after Muslim terrorists and Islamic terrorists than they are Christians, white people, Catholics, what have you. The same root cause is behind the entire grooming gangs myopia. The police, the government, political parties didn't want to pay off those sectors of the electorate, namely Muslims, by provoking them. So they turned a blind eye. It is the straightforward politicization of our police service. That is the one and the only explanation. That's why Fair Cop does what it does. We want the police to serve without fear or favour. We want justice and the police put their blindfold back on. Not give a flying toss whether somebody is Muslim, Catholic, black, white, yellow, green, or what have you. If they are engaged in a dangerous ideology, then they need investigating. But a dangerous ideology is an ideology which threatens the fundaments of the United Kingdom. Terrorism is not showing support for less immigration. Terrorism is not calling for Islamic hate preachers to be thrown out of the country. Terrorism is not showing sympathy for the victims of grooming gangs. Terrorism is when you do what those idiot Palestinian lot did the other day, when they broke into an RAF base and caused £25 million of damage by pouring paint into the jet engine of an RAF plane. That's terrorism. And the police need to be involved in preventing that, not involved in delivering an agenda set by repeated governments and their ridiculous orthodoxy.
Javi, you're roughly the same age as me. You're a former police officer. You remember how we used to treat Irish terrorists and Irish suspected terrorists and the Irish community in general. And that was only 30, 40 years ago. And bring it to today. How pink and fluffy are we now compared to how we used to deal with terrorists and terrorist supporters 30, 40 years ago?
Well, we say we're pink and fluffy, but I don't think we are pink and fluffy. Not really. I think if you asked Lucy Connolly, for instance, whether she thinks the police are pink and fluffy, she would say no, they have more in common. Point. They have far more in common with the Stasi. I have never broken a law in my life other than a few speeding fines, and yet I've been interviewed by the police 3 times now and arrested once. The last time that I was interviewed by the police under caution with a threat of arrest was in November of 2024. And the reason for that is because I wrote a piece for The Critic in which I named my stalker, former police officer Lindsay Watson of Leicestershire Police. I said that my stalker was a man. And the police investigated me under the auspices of the Online Safety Act for willfully spreading misinformation about the sex of my stalker, and that this had caused my stalker not insignificant psychological damage. That is, I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I'm honest. I preferred it when police officers, when their violence was out in the open, where you knew they were violent because they threatened to put your lights out, because then it was clear what violence is. This soft, underhand violence that is disguised beneath the fluffy rainbow slippers is still violence, and it's absolutely sick, and we need to put up to it.
Alec, let me tell you what I think's going on. I think Prevent is being used ready for mass civil disobedience and civil violence. I think a civil war's potentially coming to the UK. I don't mean two different armies, Roundheads and Cavaliers. I mean urban warfare, a little bit like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, over those couple of decades. And I think the government's been warned about this for decades. We're beginning to split along racial lines, religious lines, political lines. No one's happy. We're all looking at each other now as the enemy, as the other, as strangers. Even Keir Starmer says we're a nation of strangers. And that's fine when everything's going well. But things aren't going well anymore now. We're short of resources. We're short of money. We're going bankrupt. None of the public services work. You can't get a house. You can't buy a home. Things are getting worse. And I think Keir Starmer now is looking at, how do I keep a lid on this? And how do I get ready for the mass violence that's potentially coming to the UK? We saw what he did in Southport, the heavy fist, the political prisoners we now have in jail. I think this is all preempting the balkanization of the UK. And I think he's fearful, the elite are fearful, and this is just the next step in trying to dampen it down as much as he can. Does any of that sound true to you, Alec?
The political class are absolutely terrified of the white working class, in other words, the indigenous British population. And their instincts are to just continually clamp down on ordinary people. As you've pointed out, things are starting to decline. We've imported millions of people. We've now got all of these different ghettos across the country. There's been no assimilation. So we've got a whole country of different ethnic groups that have little in common. And as you say, if things start to decline, if the welfare state starts to crumble, if the economy just gets worse, and heaven forbid you have things like financial crisis and other things, then people aren't going to pull together. They're going to be, competing with each other, and that can get very ugly. And the elite are increasingly starting to become aware that the rails are coming off, and their only instincts are to just continue to clamp down on the majority native population. That's all they can think to do. They would rather do that than acknowledge they got it wrong and start to reverse the problems they created.
Isn't it that this is their playbook? It's worked all my life. It's worked. I don't remember a time where this didn't work. You batter the working class, you call them racist, you call them a misogynist, you call them a Nazi, a fascist, and we've become a nation of weak men. I wrote a book about it, and you can trace it back to the two world wars. We lost our bravest men in those wars. Those genes were never replenished, and then we had globalism after the Second World War, and we've become inferior versions of the English men that went before. And this playbook has always worked. I just don't think it works now. Immigration is the number one topic across the West, number one topic in this country. I've got people telling me this who have never spoken to me about politics ever in my life. And they're saying immigration, immigration, immigration. It just can't continue across the West, regardless of what the government does. Shane, do you think the government, because that's what this is about. This is what Prevent are doing. This is all about trying to tackle the backlash to mass immigration. You've got problems in Australia. Do you think the cat can go back in the bag now? Do you think we'll shut up about mass immigration?
So no, and that's because of decreasing populations in first world countries. But there's a couple of other things. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with fifth generation warfare, which is the cyber warfare, which we're currently in. So when we talk about a future civil war, we're actually kind of already there, because a lot of this psyops and influence and campaigns are being done online, which we've never had before. So you can actually reach out and influence and recruit and radicalize anyone online, whereas 20 years ago, you had to go to a rally, you had to go to a hall and listen, and you could see numbers and then you could do interventions. Now it's all online. It's on Telegram, it's on Facebook, it's on Snapchat, it's on X. And it's harder and harder for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to stay one step ahead. That's one of the first conversations and realisms the West has got to have. This is a new concept, which we haven't really seen for a couple of hundred years since print media, when they tried to silence independent people who could print their own newspaper and get their word and their views out. So until we start understanding that, which is why I go back to education in our school systems and understanding that point, that teenager, when a youth is trying to find out, where do I fit? What do I believe in? What do I understand? What's going on in my society? What's going on in my tribe? Because the human evolution, the human brain hasn't caught up with modern technology. And so a lot of this is why the algorithms on TikTok and Instagram are really affecting the youth and the younger population, because it's changing brains and they're being very influenced and indoctrinated in their bedrooms, in their homes. And so in the past, when you would have a rally, or they would say meet at this place at this time, law enforcement or the government or anyone, the media, could see and interview people who would gather at that rally and ask the simple question, why are you here? What are you trying to, and so stop it that way. Because it's being done online, that's the greatest threat. Like, why in Australia, the government came out and has banned anyone under the age of 16 being on social media. It's to stop that early influence and indoctrination. Because as any psychologist or psychiatrist will tell you, those algorithms actually now alter, there's evidence that they alter the juvenile brain, which is why China pumped the TikTok into the West, but they don't allow it in China. You know, so this is the first realism that we've got to come to understand, that it's not being done overtly, it's being done covertly, clandestinely, online and in the homes. Once we get a grip and understand and acknowledge that, then we can have a fair quote unquote fight. But until we do this, this isn't what we've seen in the past. And there's a very famous saying, hard times make hard men make soft times make soft men. And that's where we're at now.
You said a word there that jumped out at me, and it was tribe. And I think all of this comes down to tribalism, because we're tribal creatures at the end of the day. We've been designed to live in small tribes and to protect the tribe. This social media, the internet has been a wonderful invention, but like all inventions, it can be used for good and for bad, just like the printing press. But beyond social media, the reason why we have the problem is because we have people living in our countries who have not assimilated. They may be second, third, fourth generation, but they still have this longing for an ancient homeland they've probably never been to and don't even understand. And they feel separated from that homeland. They don't feel they belong in this new homeland, and they're wide open to be converted for terrorism and to be angry. That's a huge part.
That we've got to ask and answer. Why? Why is it someone who's third generation or fourth generation, whose grandparents were born in the UK or Australia, and they don't speak that, Arabic or Farsi or Pashto or whatever, why do they feel more or want to claim that external homeland rather than where they were born and their parents were born? That's the question that government's too scared to ask and answer. Yeah.
I mean, that should be a topic for another day on here, because I think we need to really, really get into that. And that's a great point. But gents, please stay with us. We need to go for another break. And when we get back, we'll jump straight back into this here at The Pulse. Welcome back to the protagonists here at The Pulse. Harry, I used a word a minute ago, balkanization of the UK. Do you think it's happening? I can see it along racial, religious, cultural, political lines. Am I just exaggerating?
No, I don't think you are. I mean, I'm all for multiculturalism in many respects. I will love the fact that you can walk down a metropolitan street and see people who don't look like I do, and all the rest of it. I think it's great. I think the sights and sounds and the smells and the food and the lilt of the language is all absolutely wonderful. My problem is with illegal immigration, for starters. And then my problem is where we elevate people who are, not like us. We elevate them and we give them a set of rights and a set of privileges which are not afforded to the likes of you and I. And this is done in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think if you come to this country, I think you are absolutely free to bring with you the richness and the diversity of your own culture. But, and it's a massive but, when you enter the UK, you become subject to the UK law. And if there is ever a conflict between UK law and your own culture, then your own culture takes second place every single time. I don't care whether it's your religion. I don't care whether it's your practice. I don't care if it's what your mother and their mother before did. I don't give a flying monkeys about that. When you enter our country, you obey the law. If you stay here and you want to campaign to change the law, then feel free to do so. That's one of the great things about being part of a British democracy. You are free to hold whatever view you like. You are free to campaign to have that view adopted into British law. But what you are not free to do is to say that your culture, your practice, your customs, the way that you used to do things when you were somewhere else, somehow gives you a license to do those things in this country when they are prohibited by British law. And there's been far too much pandering to groups on this basis. One of the problems that we have is that UK law is no longer the single locus of control in this country. We have an awful lot of talk about the ECHR. We have an awful lot of talk about what goes on in Strasbourg. Well, I'm sorry, but these things may be important, but they are not the single locus of control that they should be. And until we understand that if you are behaving in a way which is not approved of by our parliament and set out in law, then you need to either leave so you can practice it at your own free will somewhere else, or suffer the consequences and be locked up by a vigorous police force that is going to go after you regardless of where you're from.
But should we change our laws to help migrants fit in? Let me give you this example. In the early 1970s, we passed a law in this country to force everyone to wear motorcycle helmets because of the damage you're doing to themselves. But we exempted Sikhs. Was that something we should have done?
I don't actually think it is. No, I think if the law is the law, then it should apply to everybody. So I don't really see. I don't see any reason for that at all. I think possibly you might want to adapt a police uniform so that rather than wearing a tit helmet, you're allowed to wear some form of Sikh headwear or what have you. I don't know. But certainly when it comes to matters of health and safety, which is what a crash helmet is, no, I don't think there should be any exemption either. In the same way with a hijab, if you can't walk into a bank wearing a motorcycle helmet, I don't think you should be able to walk into a bank with your face veiled for religious reasons either. And that's what I mean by having a single locus of control, which is British law.
Alec, anything else to add to that?
Well, I'll politely disagree with Harry. The concern is beyond just illegal immigration. It's obviously the mass legal migration we've had. And people have demanded that, okay, well, if we're going to have immigration imposed on us, can they at least integrate? Can they at least adhere to our laws? But the question is, well, where does the law come from? It should be coming from the British people, and the British people have their own culture. And if you bring in a load of other people with other cultures, they're going to move to change the law. Hence, you get minorities get exemptions or privilege and what have you. And this, over time, starts to accumulate. And that's where you get the destabilization and the social friction. And as you said a few moments ago, Nick, This is why we're starting to see balkanization, because people are allowed to form ghettos. So I just think to myself, well, why would you bother creating this multicultural environment that destroys social cohesion and undermines the rule of law in the first place?
I think it has to destroy it at all. I think the government, which is set by which is elected by the British people, should set the amount of lawful immigration that is healthy and good for this country. It should enforce that. If we don't like it, then every 5 years we get the opportunity to change that. But once you've been invited into this country, then I think I think it only adds to our sense of richness as British people. I don't think there's any danger at all if we stick to rigid rules about only allowing people in by quota, by whatever. I don't really think there's any danger of us suddenly being overwhelmed and swamped. I think the problem is when we allow unchecked immigration, when we allow illegal immigration, and we pander to them, then there becomes a problem. But I don't think immigration is a problem per se. I think it's about control that's the problem, or the lack thereof.
Let me jump in there. Immigration has always been an issue in the UK all my lifetime, since Windrush. What most people don't understand is Windrush landed in 1948. In 1950, the government had to set up a special cabinet committee to look at immigration 2 years after Windrush. Why? Because people were saying, we don't want any more of immigration. We don't want any more of immigration. The vast majority of people didn't say that because the migrants hadn't moved into their neighbourhoods. But the British people have always been against the vast majority have been against immigration into the UK for many reasons. It's become more an issue now because the numbers are dramatically increased, and it's now creeping into middle-class areas. It's now having an impact on middle-class people as opposed to just the poor working-class neighbourhoods of our poor cities. Shane, you've got the same problem in Australia. What are you doing in Australia different from the UK?
Not much, really. Our numbers aren't as high because of our sovereign border policy, where we have the ability, being an island, to stop.
We're an island, and we have no ability to stop anything either.
Yeah, so and then we did offshore detention for those that were caught trying to come into the country. The key for me is, and I've done a lot of work with juvenile offenders that have come across, immigrated to Australia, and they come across, they can't speak the language, they have no government support, the social cohesion plan is terrible, so therefore they look around and go, right, where do I fit in? I fit in that suburb. They're all from my home country, they speak my language, they can help me get services, and I'll feel safer there. There was one young individual I worked with from the Middle East. His mother had actually worked for the United Nations, and that's how they got to Australia after working in a number of countries. And the government gave them a translator for 2 weeks, put them in just a suburb in Sydney, and then left them. And they didn't speak English. They didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand how to get services. And so they looked around for where their population was, and they rented out the house the government gave them to move into a 2-bedroom unit in another suburb where they spoke the language and understood people and knew people. So that's the biggest issue across the board, both in Australia, the US, UK, is this is what's causing the ghettos and the groupings of different nationalities. Is if you're going to do social cohesion, you've got to do social cohesion, and you've got to actually make them put some lines in or some policies in place where they understand what it means to be British, what it is to be Australian or American. This is who we are. This is our history. And if you want to stay here, this is our norms. This is what we do. For example, in the UK, soccer is our number one sport. So your kids are probably going to have to play soccer. Things like this. But we don't understand social cohesion for a start. So if we don't get that right, if we don't get the entering policies correct, then it's like trying to hold back the tide. It just runs away from you downstream. So This is what governments don't understand, because you've actually got to roll your sleeves up and do a bit of work in that early policy. When someone who doesn't speak English comes to an English majority speaking country, what services do you wrap around that person or family that are immigrating legally to help them assimilate into your culture? That's where the governments are failing.
Aren't we really fighting human nature? Because we've all heard the saying, birds of a feather flock together. This is human nature. People want to be with people like them. We want friends to be like us, so we seek out people with the same hobbies. Yes,
if you are in an area that you don't understand, you don't speak the language, you are going to go for safety and security. It goes back to tribe. When we left the cave, we left with our tribe. And if you go to somewhere where you don't know the tribe and you don't know the language, you don't know the customs, you are going to seek out familiarity and security. That's the issue. And that's why social cohesion isn't working anywhere, because it's too much work for governments. They look tougher and they win elections on domestic security policies, not social cohesion. And that's, for example, in Australia, our biggest problem.
Yeah, let me throw this out to Javi. Let me put this out there. People don't come to England, UK, Australia to be English, to be Australian. They come here for a better life. Most of them have it's not a desire that I want to move there because I want to be an English man. I want to be an Australian woman. I'm going where the most resources are, where I'll have a better life. They never think of assimilation, integration. We may say it to them, but they don't come here for that.
I think there are certain cultures where that's a problem, but I think that's based on culture. It's not based on immigration per se. I know many Americans. I know many French people. Surprisingly, I know people from all over the globe who come to this country and assimilate beautifully. I think what we're talking about is when there is a loyalty and an adherence to something other than British sovereignty and British law, and that unfortunately is most obvious with Islam, where jihad trumps British law, where the words of the Prophet Muhammad trump anything that is said in Parliament. Then we have a problem. That is nothing to do with immigration per se. It's to do with the immigrants holding on to a set of beliefs and a locus of control which is entirely at odds with us here in a parliamentary democracy.
Thank you, Alec. We've got probably 50 seconds left for each guest to round up. Alec, you've got 50 seconds.
Well, what I'll say is we can all point to examples of first-generation immigrants who do actually really like our country and come here and do want to become a part of the nation. And indeed, if they marry in, then that shows a commitment. But even so, we have this perpetual problem of second, third-generation immigrants. They even though their parents have come here and they wanted to join the nation, that they still have this problem with identity. And it all stems from the fact that they know that their ancestry is not from these lands, and that always plays on their identity. So you're always going to have the problem of multiculturalism and problems with identity if you have immigration. And that's why we shouldn't have immigration, in my opinion.
And isn't part of that problem that we downplay our country? We're not patriotic enough. We don't sell them a vision of this country, that how great we are, how great you can be. You're part of it. We work together for the betterment of mankind. There's no British story anymore now. We've just become a Heathrow airport lounge where anyone's welcome until you go somewhere else. We need to increase patriotism in this country for migrants, for children of migrants, for everybody. We have to sell them the story. Shane?
Well, I do agree with Alec on 90% of that, but you can never not have immigration, especially with current birth rates, and especially with what the World War II did to Western populations. But everything else he said, it's not the first generation. It's the second, third, and fourth that struggle with identity. He's 100% correct there.
Yep, I sort of agree with 95% of what you just said then. I don't think we need immigration. We may have falling birth rates across the Western world. That in itself isn't a problem. We will deal with it. We have technology, we have AI. All those problems only seem like problems because our politicians are weak, stupid, with no backbone, and they just keep putting sticking plasters on our problems called immigration. Harry?
Well, we talked about earlier, we talked about human nature, and it is human nature to gather together in groups and plan.
Oh, I think we've lost Harry. Hopefully he'll pop back in a second, and I'll hand the time back over to him.
Also, that's why we have the great continent of America. It's why we have Australia.
Oh, Harry, we've lost you.
It's as simple as that. Being migration is absolutely natural, and it's part and parcel of the human.
Yep. Right. Thank you, everybody, for coming on the show. Excellent discussion. You've all given me something to think about. And I think the lesson is immigration's more complicated than we all think. See you soon at the Pulse.